In this lesson, we'll explore how we can add texture to the horns of our forest creature concept by sampling from an image of some wood. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we have our concept once again, and in between lessons I continue to basically use the clone stamp tool and bring in some additional stone and concrete texture into the overall form of our creature here. So again, kind of establishing a base skin to start with. And so I usually try to start with some sort of base skin for a concept like this because it really allows me to start visualizing the creature, the environment that it exists in, and so forth. So we're going to continue on by focusing now on the horns. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, I'm thinking about the environment this creature exists in, probably some sort of forest or jungle. He's a creature of the earth, and so I'd like all the textures to really reflect that. I'd like the textures to feel very organic in their appearance. So we'll go ahead and kind of zoom in here, and as you can see, we've got these kind of curving horns. I've imagined them kind of being very coarse. I've got these kind of indentations kind of coming throughout these horns here. And so we're going to explore our next texture, which we have right here, which is some wood grain, which I think will add a lot of personality to his horns. So just looking at this image of this wood, it really does tell a story all by itself. We can see that time has really ravaged this wood just because we've got a lot of creases, a lot of cracks and indentations, little bitty pockets and holes throughout that really give it a lot of personality. It tells a story because it has an obvious history. And so you may want to think about that as you begin to gather textures for whatever project you plan to include them in. Think about storytelling elements and how they can really enhance your own concept. And so for our creature here, I'm imagining him as being very old, very weathered. And so this wood will work nicely in achieving that. So I'm just going to grab our marquee tool here. Let's just make a selection for this top area of this image of this weathered wood. We'll grab our move tool and bring that over. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a different approach than we did in the previous lesson in bringing in texture. This time we want this texture to follow a very specific path, which is basically these flowing lines on this curved horn right here. Whereas with the clone stamp tool, we could be very random as we place those textures because they had no real specific directions in the overall design just of all those different little indentations and creases in that stone and concrete. So what we can do is basically place this texture over the area we want to include it in and manipulate it to follow that path, okay? So now that we've moved our texture, I'm just going to go ahead and lower the opacity, and you'll notice that I brought this texture over into our group, which I've titled Horns, within our texture blocking group. So I'm just lowering the opacity of this layer containing this texture because it's going to allow me to kind of see how to manipulate it and kind of follow that path of that horn. So once we've lowered the opacity, we'll just hit Control T on our keyboard, and this lets us free transform this texture here. And so now I can kind of start to manipulate it and move it around the way I want. Now I'm kind of rotating it right now because I'm examining just the overall angle in which this horn juts out of the head. So let's go ahead and kind of start with that. Okay, great. I kind of like the angle that we have our texture kind of lined up. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and right-click within the selection, and we're going to choose Warp. So keep in mind we're still in free transform mode, and this basically kind of creates like a mesh over our transformation here that basically allows us to grab from some of these different points or just within the mesh itself and start to basically bend and warp and manipulate really this texture. And so we may want to lower our opacity just a little bit more. The reason I continue to lower it is because I want to examine the flowing lines that I've painted on the horns in my sketch, and I want basically the direction of the lines of the wood grain to really match those flowing lines as best as possible. And we'll see why later on as we incorporate a blend mode to this layer. Okay, great. I'm liking how that's looking. Let's go ahead and commit to those changes. We'll bring our opacity back up. Now let's go ahead and adjust the blend mode to overlay. Let's see what that does for us. And so that's looking pretty nice. Now, one thing I do want to do is bring up our layer mask once again. So just going back to that sketch layer, holding down Alt on the layer mask thumbnail, and we can see that confines this texture to the overall form of our forest creature here. So very cool. So we can see just the overall value that we have in our sketch is preserved while also integrating this interesting texture of this weathered wood into the horn. So now we can grab our eraser tool. We may want to use a soft round brush, just right clicking and bringing up our brush preset picker. Again, these are just default brushes that come with Photoshop. And really quick, let's go over here to our brush panel, and I'm going to turn on transfer, okay? And so these are basically just some different settings that we can use for our brush tips. And under transfer, we got a couple of settings for opacity and flow. And I'm just going to make sure that the control for each one of these is set to pen pressure since I'm using a Wacom stylus. And so what this really just lets me do is control the opacity and flow based off the amount of pressure I apply with my stylus as I press it to the screen here. So what I'm doing now is I'm just coming around to these hard edges. I'm just kind of erasing away, kind of fading them out. And that's going to prove useful as I bring in an additional piece of that wood. And so that's starting to look really cool, look really interesting. Go ahead and make another kind of quick comparison, just kind of see how that's looking. So let's come back over here to our wood texture. And this time we'll go ahead and just kind of grab maybe this bottom part. So starting out with something like this, I try to grab as many different areas as I can first. And eventually we can continue to sample from all over. And as we begin to weave it together, we just want to be mindful of any repeating patterns. Okay? All right. So we'll go ahead and take just this same approach as we did previously. So just lowering the opacity, free transforming it. Now in this case, I want to be mindful of the light source. Again, this is something I mentioned in the previous lesson with our cracked stone texture. In fact, let's bring our opacity back up, and you'll notice the lighting, if we revert this back, is kind of coming from the top. So we want to rotate it this way just so the lighting matches up with the light source that we've already established just with our sketch, okay? So let's go ahead and kind of realign this wood texture. I'm kind of shrinking it down just slightly there. Bring our opacity back down once again. And kind of examining the overall angle that we're kind of dealing with right here. And that's feeling about right. So now that we're still in free transform mode, I'll go ahead and right click and go to warp. And just like before, we'll kind of start bending and skewing this texture. So I'm just kind of looking at the lines and the grain of the wood. I'm just kind of trying to match them up with the overall curvature just of the horn. I'm also looking now at the previous texture that I applied, just making sure that it kind of lines up with where that texture ends a little bit. Just as far as the overall angle and flowing of the grains of the wood. Okay, very cool. Let's go ahead and commit to that. Bring our opacity way back up. And we'll go ahead and once again, we'll try overlay and just kind of see what that does for us. Now we won't always use overlay. Another good blend mode sometimes is soft light. So kind of play around. There's really no exact science. Play around with some of these blend modes and just see what you really feel like is working, okay? So in this case, I may want to go ahead and stay with overlay. Grabbing my eraser tool, kind of blending in kind of the ends of this texture. I'm going to also copy that layer mask up once again. Just kind of bringing that up there as well. Very nice. So we'll go ahead and continue on here. Now this is going to be the next thing we're going to kind of focus on. I'm thinking about kind of changing the overall form of where the base of the horn is. We'll go ahead and kind of zoom out here. And I may want to kind of have a slight arc to it. So this is an instance where, again, we're not bound to that initial sketch, that grayscale sketch that we started out with. We can start to really make additional changes to the overall form if we choose to. Again, that was just a nice springboard to really get us started. By no means should it hinder our creativity. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, grab my lasso tool, we'll jump back to this texture here, and let's just go ahead and grab just a smaller piece this time. So something like that. We'll go ahead and bring this over. Kind of getting that out of the way there. All right, so let's go ahead and free transform this texture. And again, I'm kind of thinking about the light source, so that looks about right. And so I mentioned I kind of want to adjust the base of this horn. It feels a little bit thin. It feels like it could be just a little bit stronger, a little bit wider at the base. And so this would be an example where we can really use texture to kind of change the overall form of our concept here. And we're going to explore this again a few times more as we move forward in later lessons. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, just lower the opacity just slightly here. Now I'm going to go ahead and right click and choose warp within our transformation. And I'm just kind of starting to adjust the overall form of this piece of wood that I've brought over. Bring up my opacity once more. We'll kind of zoom out here. So I'm just kind of trying to basically add a little bit more of an arc right there. Basically just kind of trying to make the base just feel a little bit stronger. Okay, let's go ahead and commit to that change. All right, so you can kind of see what I was talking about right there, just kind of making it feel a little bit more strong. Now what we can do is grab our eraser tool and just kind of start to blend out these really hard edges. Now this is an example where I'm not going to use a blend mode because I'm looking at it and I'm liking how it's looking. And since I'm kind of changing the overall form, I'm not really needing to overlay it onto anything, right? Okay, in fact, we could try and see what overlay does, and that really doesn't give me the visual look that I'm going for, all right? So again, you don't always have to use a blend mode. You can use the textures all by themselves. And again, I'm thinking about the light source and just kind of how that works with that specific area. Later on, we could come in if we wanted to kind of adjust the overall lights and darks, we could using either our dodge or burn tool, but that's something we can always focus on later. So in between lessons, I'm going to continue on basically incorporating pieces of this wood texture on the rest of this curved horn as well as the opposing horn and even this little stump too. So in between lessons, definitely take full advantage of using this texture and continue on exploring how you would basically incorporate these different pieces of this wood texture in really just giving these horns just a lot more personality, depth, and dimension. So in the next lesson, we're going to basically move forward in adding additional organic textures. And we're going to kind of shift down here to the overall bust of the character and focus on adding in some bark. So stick around and we'll see you in the next lesson.